What is going on, Hot Take Nation? It is DRW here for another episode of the Hot Take of the Day podcast. And today's guest is Justin Bliffen, who is CEO of Brigade Energy Services. I get a lot of feedback from our listeners that we sometimes spend too much time on oil because, going into March, it was the only commodity that actually mattered. And that we didn't spend enough time talking to midstream guests or oilfield services guests. So we are trying to remedy that. And so I'm really excited that Justin is going to spend the next hour with us. Justin, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Cannot complain. And very much appreciate you having me on DRW. Looking forward to it.
I am as well. We don't talk about oilfield services a lot. And I would love, before we really dive into some of the nuances, give me a state of the industry as you see it today and a little bit of a background on Brigade Energy Services.
Sure. Appreciate the time and the question. So Brigade is a private equity-backed well servicing company. We were formed and started almost 4 years ago, end of 16, early 17, with a ambitious endeavor and undertaking and investment thesis to consolidate and, more importantly, innovate some of the well servicing space. And so we've been doing just that over the last number of years, looking at various companies and trying to bring them into the family and raise the bar and professionalize and integrate and again start evolving those companies. State of the industry, your first question. Look, it's tough. We thought 2016 was tough, and then 2020 happened. And I suspect that in the 80s, they probably thought 82 was tough until 86 rolled around. And hopefully we don't have 15 years of inflation-adjusted $10 oil, but I think that all of us need to prepare for the worst, and anything better than that is gravy.
So talk to me about the innovate part of that strategy, because when you think about oilfield services and certainly as I understand Brigade, you do a lot of well servicing, service rig work, etc. Not on the fracture side, not on the drilling side, not just so when I think about innovation and as I think about the state of the industry, I think a lot about cost management. What do you think about when you think about innovation in the oilfield service space? Sure.
So first off, just by way of background a little bit to help answer the question and the rest of the podcast, I'm not a 25-year well servicer or even an oilfield services guy.
If you were, I was going to say whatever you're using as a lotion on your face to keep you young, I would love to know that, because if you're a 25-year well servicing hand, you are good looking. You're making it work.
Yeah. Thank you. First podcast, by the way, take it easy on me here. So, look, it is well servicing. What I'm talking about is workover rigs. So we are a pooling unit company. Obviously, most people, when they talk about rig counts, they're talking about, Baker Hughes drilling rig count. We're pooling units, workover rigs, life of well, work. So we do full life of well, new well completion. Generally, our work is, new well, plug, drill out, mill outs, and clean outs, and then tube ups on new well construction. What most people think about when they think about our business line is the life of well production, remediation, workover. That can be very simple work, such as wrenching rods, to more complex squeeze job workovers, what have you. And then end of life, whether it's 7 years or 27 years down the road, P&A, you bring in our assets, equipment, teams to do that as well. It's a space that's highly fragmented, been around forever. Plenty of cliches about the space, potentially low barriers to entry. I don't think they're quite as low as sometimes we get a rap for, but there's over 200 players in this space. Richard Spears would call it a $3 to $7 billion market. Wide bid ask there, but depending on the times, and so highly competitive. There are used to be 10 or so, probably now it's more like 6 or so major consolidators of yesteryear, decades of consolidation that make up a large percentage of the market in any basin USA. And then there's a long flat tail of many small independent down market service operators. So that's the space. To your question about, and then to my involvement in the space real quick, I've done a bunch of different things. I spent 12 years in the service, thus the some of the patriotic themes through Brigade and the flag behind me here. I'm not asking for your vote today, although it does kind of appear that way. If you're tuned in,
I'll vote for you. I mean, it seems better than a lot of the options that are out there right now.
Perfect day to solicit votes. After the debate last night, but. No, I was in the service for 12 years, came out, went to school. I've been in energy, in evil Wall Street, the vampire squid of America. And then I've also, made my way out to the oil field here in Denver, Colorado about 10 years ago, and was part of a company that built a non-op, built an operator, upstream operator, drilled 150 or so wells, participated in 600 non-ops. We ambitiously started vertically integrating into our service chain with rock pile,
right?
Rack company, Caliber, a midstream company, some other cats and dogs. Did all that for a bit. Left in 2016, went on a 9-month vision quest. Started looking at everything. I think it's important to talk. The last 2 days I've talked to 2 friends in oil and gas Denver about their vision quest that they're launching on right now.
Tell me about a vision quest. I've never heard that expression before.
Well, I'm kind of playing with it, but just meaning a time when you're in between opportunities, in between jobs, and stepping back and really thinking about being introspective with yourself and what you want to do next, and then think about state of industry, and then ultimately building some type of thesis, investment thesis, mission statement, and going and getting after it. And
what did you find? Like, so for context, so you're at Triangle at the time, 2014, and I think Triangle and the other one I think about is Emerald, being the two sort of Bakken, like Wall Street driven, like find the arbitrage, do all the neat things that Wall Street was encouraging us to do from 2012 to 2014. Many young people won't remember this, but oil used to be over $100 a barrel. Natural gas used to be over $4 a barrel. And a lot of the core was owned, but we were having these fringe and adjacent fringe assets, which is a tweet I saw today, which I thought's a great name, that worked at $100. And then all of a sudden, you go from every service rig, every frac crew, everything being absolutely jammed up, can't do it. And guys like Liberty with Chris Wright, like Triangle with Rockpile and Caliber, started getting creative about the business model and reinventing it to say, hey, we can build this service. But then 2014, September happens, oil prices crash, the adjacent acreage doesn't work anymore, and the companies a lot of companies went in a death spiral in 15 and 16, and then you started your vision quest. So that was background obviously for those who might not have been around, and in particular in the Bakken at that time. But what were you finding effective in your vision quest in terms of driving and stimulating thought? The industry was gutted. It was 2016. What were you doing at the time?
Yeah, so your recap of Triangle is very accurate, and there's obviously tons more to that story, and good and bad. It's a case study. It could be 12 case studies, on state of industry and other aspects. I think the biggest legacy out of Triangle, as I look back on it, is just the wonderful people that were in that family of companies. There was a lot of value created in an explosive way in a short period of time. Ultimately, a lot of value was destroyed as well, the downside of our industry. But the people that were in that organization have gone off, and they're doing upstream businesses, midstream businesses, service businesses all over the oil patch, and they're all having wonderful success. So, I think that's, just a, exclamation point on the team that was at Triangle. Back to Vision Quest, and eventually I want to get back to that innovate and well service.
Yeah, well, I told you we wander. This is what we do. Smart conversations with smarter people than me, and they go where they go.
No, I've spent a lifetime surrounding myself by smarter people than myself, and it's worked out pretty well. But yeah, no, I think my vision quest was a challenging one. Had just suffered, as well as all of our stakeholders, a big financial setback, career setback. I had a baby on the way, a wife in law school, and wasn't even sure I could work in oil and gas again. Spent 2-3 months looking at everything outside of oil and gas, and ultimately came back. I came back for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, because I'm super passionate about this space. Reducing reliance on foreign barrels of oil, domestic energy, everything that Chris Wright talks about. The intimate link between human health and hydrocarbon. I'm a full gospel preaching believer, but I have my own angle on it, which is a little bit more from international, lack of a coherent energy policy driving our foreign policy for many years, and that certainly affected me and all my friends as a young man. So that's kind of a whole nother thread that whatever we can pick up later. But for me, that was probably one of the main driver reasons, and then many others. I just knew a lot about the space, had learned so much at my time, trading energy and then building, helping build energy companies, upstream services, midstream. Knew so many people, knew so much about the space. I'm a generalist. Look, I'm not a petroleum engineer from School of Mines. I am a systems engineer, so but I know enough to be dangerous in any one topic. But very passionate about the space, love the people in the space, and ultimately love the work that we do. And if I were to get on my soapbox rant about that for half a second, if you allow me, at the end of the day, we mostly have North American investors investing in American entrepreneurs, whether small, medium, or large, public or private. We go take risk, try to execute. We hire lots of Americans. We pay lots of taxes in various forms, and not just the direct employees, but all the indirect employees that help all these companies, across the value chain. And then, what are we doing? Well, we're, supplying cheap hydrocarbon and energy to our fellow Americans safely, responsibly, to support our entire way of life. And it's just, and hopefully we haven't done good broadly as an industry, with certainly exceptions. We haven't been good at delivering a return over the last decade, but the returns are there, the assets are real, and that return ultimately goes back to American investors. So what's not to like about that virtuous cycle that we're all a part of?
Well, and I think, one of the stats I read, and it was a number of years ago, and so someone will have to fact check me on this and they can send me a DM, but I believe that the number is for every direct commodity or resource job, there's 5 to 7 jobs created in the community. So you look at a city like Midland, which is so built around the infrastructure of this industry. So when like last night during the debates, when Biden's saying, he changed his answer 4 times, but I want to end fracking kind of maybe on federal land, but I didn't say that because I don't actually want to say anything, because I just don't want to screw anything up in the next 14 days. So just don't listen. Okay, folks? Okay, come on. But you lose 11 million jobs because for the 1.5 million to 2 million employees who are in the oil and gas industry, they create 5 to 7 jobs of spinoffs, which are firemen and teachers and police and wait staff and plumbers, and because they are the ones who are using the commodity of the earth to generate new wealth. It's not like bankers in New York who are just pulling fees off wealth that's already been created. It's you're using the earth, you're selling a product, you're paying your people, and it generates jobs in the economy. And so when you lose a resource job, cities and towns die. We've seen that with coal. We've seen that with gold, and that. So I think about that a lot. We do so much good, and we do such a poor job of getting the mainstream media to talk about the good. They like the narrative because the narrative is easy. And I listened to the Joe Rogan podcast this morning as I was driving my son. He had Tom Papa on, who's also a comedian. And the beginning of the podcast, actually, it was from October 14th. They talked about masks. And Joe Rogan was the first mainstream media, huge profile person to take on the topic of masks because no one else wants to touch it. And then they also talked about lithium and conflict minerals. And like they actually had a real debate that everyone else wants to avoid. And in particular, a famous person wants to avoid. God forbid that they should, offend a fan. So I love your point. But Tom Papa, to me, represented the average American who just isn't thinking through wind and solar's neat. But it takes 250 acres for the Indian Point nuclear facility in New York that they're going to decommission in the next few years. To generate that same amount of power is 500,000 acres of wind farms. 500,000 acres of wind farms, and each of those turbines needs to be made of coal to make steel, to be coked, the cement for the base, and then the birds, and that land is totally unusable. Plus you need to build transmission lines, which are in part what causes wildfires. And so no one is having a intellectually honest debate about energy in America. So I appreciate the soapbox that you went on because it gave me a soapbox to go say that.
Well, look, we could stir this pot back and forth. I mean, look, I would suspect that your listenership is a pretty safe audience to spout off. I mean, I think, as I think about us in our industry, we are good at doing our jobs. And I'm speaking in broad brushstrokes and generalities, so forgive me. But we from field level up to executive, we want to put our heads down and just work hard and do our jobs and expect that it'll all work itself out. Clearly, all the facts are on our side. So this misinformation global campaign, that's out there is ultimately going to fall on its face because we understand the math. And you just started quoting some of it, but we could go back and forth and all of our listeners have their own data points here. One thing I don't think we're as good at, although we're getting better for the likes of folks like yourself, is promoting and using all the modern channels to promote, to tell the story, to inform the public, and have one conversation at a time, one listener at a time, to start getting that other narrative out there, which is so important, so valuable. So when I was thinking about this coming on and doing these type of things, and we're trying to get a little bit better and smarter around social media and telling our story. I think it's important for all of us in industry, big, medium, small, public, private, to try to think about and do a better job of promoting and telling our story instead of just finding out and doing our job.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting. Our industry historically, it is an older industry, and I think back to when I started my career. I was a petroleum engineer. I suppose I still am, but I don't really do that anymore. But I think back to 2000 and everyone who'd been in from 1985 and had gone through downturn after downturn after downturn and streamline. And then there was the Senate hearings in 2001 about the shortage of natural gas. Conventional oil, F&D was going up every year. Prices were sort of going up. We were trying to figure out the model, but it just no one could do it. But those were the incumbents when I started. And then you go forward to 2012 and we go through this incredible boom cycle. And if you were in the industry between 2001 and 2014, it was almost impossible not to make money because oil went from 30 to 147 in basically a straight line. Natural gas obviously peaked in 2006 when it was 14 an MCF and then declined. So the natural gas people got hurt. But there wasn't a lot of innovation or intelligence that was actually driving what happened. Certainly there were some technological innovations, horizontal wells and fracking in particular, that opened it up. But if you happen to be sitting on land in 2004 and you kept it, you did extremely well. And the reason I bring all that up is because the model of the innovators were the old guys who'd just been around for a long time. And when you look at the Teslas and the Amazons and the Yahoos, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Twitters, these guys were disruptive innovators, and they realized that in large part it was their brand, their personal brand, and the messaging that created what they created. Whereas we were just taking sort of something old and going from vertical to horizontal. Maybe that's too simple, but I liked your point about we didn't do a good job advertising because the guys in 1985 didn't do a good job advertising because social media wasn't a thing. And now it's 2020. We have more podcasts and personalities, and we're trying to get out there, but we're 10 years behind the curve. And so how do we change the narrative and change the message? Now, we were talking about your vision quest. I'm curious, so it was your love of the industry that brought you back. You didn't see opportunities outside of the industry in 2016. How did you balance the downturn and the cyclicality versus I just want to go into tech or banking or whatever and do something?
Yeah. Well, so when I had my own path that brought me back to oil and gas and started digging in again, most of the opportunities that were coming my way were, things that I'd spent much of, the preponderance of my time on previously, which was finance and upstream. And so, whether it was private equity backed venture or distressed public company, I had just left a distressed public company where I knew where all the bodies were buried. Didn't necessarily want to go into another one where I didn't. And on the private equity side, I worked with some great guys. We, met most of the private equity players in the space throughout that period of time and had some wonderful conversations and learning experiences. But, broadly, the term sheets were narrower in mandate and the bars to clear on profits or what have you were higher. And all of that was completely reasonable and understandable. And at the same time, that even in the darkest of days of 2016, whether you want to call it, February $26 oil or tragic events that happened in May, what have you, the darkest days of 16, in my humble opinion, assets were still bid up all over the map on the upstream side, not just in the Permian, but pick any corner of any basin. Asset prices never sold off, maybe as much as they should have in 2016. At the same time that the mandates were narrow and the bars were higher, and so that was one mathematical reason I started looking beyond upstream opportunities. But the more reason I went into services was really just introspection on how I want to spend my most precious commodity, which is time. And I think that many of us are very much what we did as a young man, right out of in our first job or what have you. For me, from 18 years old to 30, I was in the Navy, the service, and that the service is about men and equipment in a hazardous environment, doing a tough job on time, etc. So clearly you can see some of the similarities, the parallels to a service culture, a successful service culture. I had a very small part of Rockpile. I don't take too much credit for it. All the credit belongs to guys like Kurt Dosser and Paul George and James Evans and many others. I'm not naming there, that really built that great frac company that used to compete, with the likes of the titans of Chris Wright and Liberty and such. But man, I was super proud to have a small part of that. I learned a lot through observing that. I also learned a lot of being a customer and a consumer of services, building an E&P company from 0 barrels a day to 20,000 barrels gross, across the value chain. You learn a lot through that as well. Mm-hmm. And I just love the idea of trying to do something bold, ambitious in services, despite not coming from a service background, which really held me back for months. I had this board up in my office that had all these other opportunities rolling through the 1 through 6 hole. And I kind of had this 7 or 8 idea on the service side that eventually my wife called me out and said, why does that one never move up the board? And, my answer was, well, I love that one, but I don't have the right experience. I'm not a 25-year well servicer or fracker or what have you. And she challenged me on it, as she does, pretty much every day. And I dug in. I started really looking at the space and building out an investment thesis. And it was a space that, kind of 9 out of 10 mentors, maybe 10 out of 10, said, man, well, let me say, every stone I looked under was a little ugly, and the next stone was maybe even a little uglier. 9 out of 10 mentors said, man, that's pretty tough. It's pretty ambitious. It's been tried before. Too hard, can't be done. And that's a surefire way to get me interested in, looking more at it. So that's kind of where it began. I wanted to get back to my roots of working with men in the field, trying to deliver a more innovative, better service quality option on this critical life of asset service side. The assets themselves are a little less correlated with WTI than many other service lines out there, because look, life of well, even if the price falls off and docks aren't being completed and wells aren't being drilled, the wells still need to be worked on. The state mandated P&As still need to occur. And I like that aspect of the business as well.
Yeah, for sure. There are hundreds of thousands of wells in the United States that, regardless of commodity price, will continue to exist down the life cycle. So we're going to talk about P&As. But one of the ideas that you started this company with was based on innovation and obviously consolidation. So let's start with innovation. So we're going back to where we started. What did you see as the biggest opportunity in the innovation side of providing that well service, soup to nuts, beginning to end of life of well, that would be innovative and disrupt the service industry in that regard?
Right. Broadly, service quality and technology. And let me come back to that and define what I mean by that. But before I go to that, let me just talk more specifically about an operational aspect that stuck with me. I kind of grew up in the Bakken. Every well that we drilled, from 2011 on, was a 22,000 total measured depth well. And one of the most challenging part of that operation was always the mill out of the plugs. And as you know, you have limited option set here. You put all this money into getting the well bore into zone, pulling off the frac, getting the proppant, into the micro fissures, getting the plug set, and then if you might have sliding sleeve in the toe or in the whole lateral or not, but you have this challenging operation of milling the plugs out, and you have. And this is pre-dissolvables, but even with dissolvables, you still want to clean the hole. You have coil or you have stick rig. Coil, even the 2 7/8 reach its limitations in a longer lateral, more complex well bore. And over the years, I've spoken to many completions engineers who have lost coil downhole. And then you have a well servicing, but you need a bigger rig, you need bigger pumps, you need bigger swivels, than much of the industry has out there. And more important, in my opinion, than all that, you need a well-led, accountable crew that is well trained and is not going to mess up that precious well bore. And there weren't and aren't a lot of options for that back then in 2011 Bakken, and even today, where you have high degree of confidence that a rig crew is going to be able to pull off that complex and important part of the job, as well as maybe provide some after action job feedback, and drive efficiencies. So there was that part. And then real quick, back to the assets and the operations themselves. Being on the finance and the CFO side of a growthy E&P, I always saw the well servicers show up. When times were good, they were in the capital budgets for the well completions. Times are good or bad, they're always showing up in the LOE, in the P&L, and in the P&A operations. And again, I like that diversity of service line and correlation to timing of our industry. Back to your important questions on innovation. For me, I kind of break it into service quality again and technology. On the service quality side, we just believe this is a space that not across the board, across all companies, but largely has in some ways been left behind a little bit. Unlike offshore or drilling rigs or most frac companies, there hasn't really been a established doctrine and competency management system of training and qualifications and vetting throughout the space. Some companies have made great progress, over the years. Some has fallen off, some has continued. But across the 200 plus service companies that are out there, we just felt like an incredible challenge, an incredible undertaking. But the challenge is the opportunity to try to truly develop best practice, doctrine. It's all, most companies, it's all tribal pass down. OJT, nothing beats OJT. But is the T the right way to do things? And, I would put to you that you could, because we've done this many times, you could bring 5 25-year well servicing guys from around the country together to talk about a specific operation and what's the best way to do it. And you might get 3 different answers, and you're calling, components and parts of the operation different things. There's some good in that. I don't want to say that, different basin characteristics of the operation and variables of what's going on at the wellhead shouldn't drive different results, but some level of standardization, identification of what are the key skill sets, what are the best ways to do things. We felt like that was important. And this all comes back from my time in the service. Whether whatever branch of service you go into, you're going to be trained up in how to do your job. You take a kid, a man off the streets from whatever his background is, you put him into a hazardous, technically complex job. And there is absolutely a doctrine and a training program of skills development to teach that individual of how to do that job.
Right.
And as there is in much of the oil field, but in well servicing, in workover rigs, again, not across all companies, but largely across the industry, I felt like we were very much behind, and we were going to take on this ambitious undertaking of identifying the 283 skill sets, organizing them into groupings, and then put pen to paper and lay down some doctrine on how to do this. And I'm not talking about lockout, tag out, and all the generic type of oil field service training here. I'm talking about specific skill sets.
Well, so we talked about P&A. And it's one of the interesting things, because there's 2 things that, as you were talking, it made me think about. Number one, the evolution of our industry, and in particular the Bakken. I remember, we had high pressure wells on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. Halliburton had pushed us as our fracking provider to use sliding sleeves because a plug and perf exercise would take too long. And it was so busy in 2009, 2010, 2011, we used the sliding sleeves. Now, of course, Halliburton wanted us to use their sliding sleeves, and we didn't. We used the Baker ones that were maxed out at 24 with the ball drop system. Balls came to surface. And what I always loved about that technology was we never had to do the drill out. And so you could flow it back, you get the balls back to surface, some number of them, and we would control our flow back so that we didn't fill the lateral with sand, and eventually the well would die after some period of time. Then you could go in with stick pipe and a drop off sub to save money. You could drill out, which I to be honest, I could never really understand how you could have like super permeable sand even if you packed it. And there's this story from like 1983 about this one time when a guy sanded off a well, and so now we drill out every well at a cost of $150,000. But it got efficient because the pressures were down. And then when we did One Energy and we were in the Permian, obviously it would take a lot longer to bring the pressures down. So coil tubing was really your only option unless you wanted to snub. And so it was interesting because the cost of the drill out was so expensive. Now, as we have infill wells and as pressures are coming down across reservoirs and wells are drilling tighter, I would think stick pipe is almost going to totally displace coil tubing as a thing. And also with the availability of services, maybe we're not as worried about snubbing. Maybe we aren't drilling out as fast because we're controlling sand. What are you seeing operators do in light of 2020 that's changing the tech around drill outs, and are they still doing it, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, you're spot on. What am I seeing right now in 2020? Obviously, having been an operator, I get it. We're all struggling to make margin, make cash flow, make ends meet, live within our means. So cost is very much driving, all considerations all the time. But look, coil is a better option in many situations. There are certain basins where, look, the lateral lengths and the vertical lengths are not as long, and pressure regimes and what have you. You can bring in coil and knock the job out quickly, no problem. Generally, and again, broad brushstrokes, lots of variables here. The longer, the more complex, and again, depending on how much pressure in the wellbore, because you introduce snubbing, which is a topic that comes up, but. Coil in those type of wells, coil will beat us in the vertical and through the heel, and then we will quickly catch up speed, in the lateral, and we can push and rotate at the same time, which takes mitigates much of the risk. And if you were to do a full, across all your wells in a field like that, cost analysis and how many times you stick coil and how many times you're going to bring in nitrogen and then you risk adjust it for the times you twist off coil.
Risk adjusted? We do risk adjusted returns? What?
Yeah, no, crazy talk.
What?
Yeah, then the stick pipe really becomes a compelling value proposition, and that's been our mandate. Can we do stick pipe better, more professional, with some better equipment, bigger equipment, and most importantly, well-led, well-trained, accountable crews that are gonna provide some job feedback.
Well, and it's funny that you say that, because the other thing that I think, again, it was like we can always frack the rock better, right? So if 2,000 pounds per foot, even though in the Bakken when you and I were both there, you with Triangle, me with Enerplus, 400 pounds per foot was like this massive amount. And we said, well, if we go to 2,000 pounds per foot, surely EURs are going to change. And I always said, well, you can't frack rock better. You can get it faster, but you can't really frack it better. But the reason I always thought the coil argument was funny, because you only ever thought about the drill out and then you moved. But at some point in the life of that well, that was an oil well, you were going to run tubing. Mm-hmm. And that tubing was required in order for you to have a reasonable anything. And so I always wanted to use the drop-off sub, because then you could drill out with stick pipe. You were bringing your service rig anyway. You pull out 10,000 feet and then you just hang your tubing, so you get a little bit more volume and you can work with that, because at some point you're going to have to come back and run artificial lift. But in the net risk adjusted return and how I viewed returns, I thought that you could avoid the coil. We never could in the Permian, obviously, but I was always fascinated by some of the risk analysis around why you should drill out and why you didn't. And I really felt like our industry, even in 2016-17, when things were horrible, we never really innovated on cost. We always just sort of did the thing that had the, 1 out of 20 times we sand off a well, so we're going to run coil at $150,000 per well, every well. And you're like, yeah, but risk adjusted, that's not great economics. So you're seeing that more now, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And I, as I was listening to talk about Bakken heyday, tweaking the variables on, well by well. Look, I'm not a petroleum engineer. I'm a systems engineer. I'm a generalist and a financier. And when I think back to those times, one of the fundamental problems that our industry often has, and again, in my humble opinion, is that we try to apply scientific method, but we never have the right sample size to do it. And every well, you're trying to, we're just, like, for instance, I remember the discussions of ceramic, resin coated proppant versus sand. And we try to do everything exactly the same on this well. And, right next to it on the same pad, we're going to change one variable. And let's do that a couple of times. But, there's all sorts of other variables that are getting introduced, despite your best intentions and efforts not to introduce the other variables. And then at, then $9 to $15 million a well bore, from spud to hooked up to production, you can't do the 1,000 examples to get a statistically significant, understanding of one variable to the next, which is why our industry and our people is so awesome, because we have to overcome that and still do our best to deploy scientific method, to find the learnings and immediately redeploy them into the capital allocation.
Well, and the amazing thing was, there were thousands of wells being drilled every year, and someone was doing something. And with a big data set, you could morph and find and learn, but you also just had to use your brain. I was always amazed at the fact that we as an industry between, I'm going to say 2011 to now, totally forgot about volumetrics, because volumetrics didn't actually meet the number of wells management wanted. And so, you would have a Bakken section that would have 20 million barrels in place. And you would say a reasonable recovery factor is 10, but let's push it to 20 just for fun. There's 4 million barrels that you can recover. If you believe your type curve is a 1 million barrel well, that's 4 wells. That's it. That's the math. It's not 8. It's not 12. It's not, and I remember the Continental Wahpeton test they did in 2014 to test 24 wells across all the benches. And some of those wells, if you look back at them now, are horrible. And you could have known. Concho with the Dominator pad was so obvious that you couldn't drill. You didn't need 24 wells. You needed 8. And ultimately, if you took 8 normal wells, multiplied those by their EUR, it's going to equal the EUR of the 24 wells. I was always amazed that people wanted to do these like little one-off experiments, and it was like they turned their brain off.
Well, look, we're still in the first, 10, 15 years, 10, 12 years of unconventional shale. And so imagine being in the first, 10 to 12 years of conventional, basins. We have much to learn, and our industry, unlike any others out there, tries to deploy our brain and from field up and take those learnings and immediately redeploy them. But real quick, I'd be remiss not to say, the second part of the earlier question, innovation. One is the service quality and the mountain that we're trying to summit on building out competency management, and then training and vetting our folks. The other is on the data side, and we are ambitiously trying to measure everything. If you can't measure it, you can't fix it. These are buzzwords in any industry, and maybe our industry is a little bit slow to pick them up broadly, but at the wellhead, and then also internal to the business. So measure everything in the business, whatever the data feed is, whether it's your ERP or your payroll, ADP, your geotabs, all the data feeds, Google, even Google Sheets and less sophisticated data feeds, and then cross-link them in a more sophisticated way and get more powerful learnings and analytics out of that. That's one major initiative that we have that I don't think is widely being done across, many of our peers and competitors in well servicing. And then measuring at the field level, measuring, when you're on that completion operation, having some instrumentation out there, and again, providing some job feedback and trying to, say, hey, this is what went well, this is what we learned, this is what we can do better next time, and trying to immediately redeploy those learnings into the next completion. Those are things that we are trying to do that, many others, are not in our competitive space.
Well, the thing that I absolutely love, regardless of innovation, regardless of technology, but the thing about your particular niche of the industry is these wells will exist for 30 to 50 years. And at the end of that 50 years or 30 years or however many years it's going to be, they have to be plugged and abandoned. So there is always a role for well servicing. Now, one of the things you talked about was it was a $3 to $7 billion industry, and that there were multi-hundreds of from big to small. We've seen consolidation in the upstream side. We're seeing consolidation in the frac servicing side. I'm curious how you think about consolidation in the context of right now, 20% of service rigs are working? Is that a fair number? What's the utilization rate across industry of service rigs?
Yeah, great question. These numbers are hard to vet. First off, and there's not that many people that are counting them. We're trying to count them and have been for a number of years. Close enough for hand grenades numbers here, as I like to say. I would say there's about 4,000 pulling units, workover rigs in the United States. Now, most of those are, from the 70s and 80s. And we have some graphs and some of the materials I sent you where it kind of shows those spike of manufactured workover rigs from that period of time. Many of those rigs today are still out there, and they have, trees growing through them on the fence line somewhere in some nook and cranny of our oil field. But they're still, one of the 4,000 or so rigs that are out there. Pre-COVID, I think that the country was probably running, these are my numbers, 1,700 to 1,800 workover rigs. If you look at EIA or AESC, that tries to track these numbers as well, they would be a little bit lighter. They'd probably be 1,300, 1,400, something like that. But I think that they're missing a lot of the little independents that are out there. Yeah. And we try to incorporate those with maybe a little bit more accuracy. At the low of the lows in COVID and in April, May, June, I think we probably got down to 300-400 pulling units. I mean, we had some multi-year customers that had 70 plus rigs out across all their service providers go down to zero. And, they didn't want rightfully so. We didn't know enough about the virus. They didn't want our guys getting sick. We had to put everything on ice, put everything on pause.
And overlaid with low commodity prices. So if a well went down, what was the point of fixing it? Just leave it, let the reservoir recharge, and as long as there wasn't a wax issue, come back and get it.
Yeah, there's a whole nother shut-in discussion that we could have around that.
Oh, we're going to have it, baby. We're going to have it.
So, yeah, you're right. Wells that were marginally economic before, the hands were forced, and many times those wells had to be shut in right away. Most of the time they were shut in without properly pickling the well and pulling rods or what have you. So things
okay, so now that's I'm going to interject. So your 1,400 rigs, you ran down to 300. So we got to like 25% capacity. And there was this overlay of shut-ins. And then you just mentioned the pickling and the rod pulling and stuff. And I know a lot of operators, I was on CNBC and Brian Sullivan asked me, is it just as easy as like turning off the wellhead? Now, I would say that the answer to that is actually yes. Now, I would say it was some nuance, because there's always nuance. Number one, if you have a well that's pumping, you could produce it one day every 4 for 3 hours, just so that things are moving and etc. You're not necessarily going to damage the well, in my opinion. I'm curious your view on the problems that you had bringing wells back on for those who shut it in. Risk adjusted, was it as big a problem that, oh my God, this is horrible, we're forced to shut this well in, and then we had a 7-week pulling job because it was all waxed up and we couldn't do it and blah blah blah? Did you see those problems or not, and what were they caused by?
Yeah, absolutely. I suspect much of your listenership could answer this question better than me, but look, I agree with you. You can easily shut in a well. It's not hard to shut in a well, but depending on the well and what's going on down the hole, you're going to have any range of issues that might emerge. And it could be, you mentioned wax, it could be paraffin, it could be water corrosion. What's the age of the well? What's the existing condition of the well? What do the rods look like? What's the pressure regime going on down there? And so there's a lot of things that can happen. Generally, again, broad brushstrokes here. If you just shut in a well, and the longer you have it shut in, the more issues are going to mount. And so one of the things that kept us going through those dark days and watching our rig count drop by 80% for some period of time there was, well, as they shut in the wells, it's going to be a boon for our business at some point in the future. And in fact, the longer they're shut in, the more issues that these oil fields are going to have across the U.S. And either you're going to bring the well back on, where you're going to have to bring in well servicing and rig crews to work on the rig, potentially, or economics might just further degrade that. Conditions might further degrade, or economics might further degrade the well, that it's going to have to be plugged. In which case, we're going to have to come and bring in one of our P&A packages to do the work. And look, we stand by that. I think that's still largely true. We haven't seen it all come back yet. It hasn't made sense, I think, for many of our valued customers and operators to broadly start firing oil fields, back up that might have been shut in. I mean, in North Dakota, they shut in 400,000 plus barrels a day, and all of that hasn't been turned back on. When it does get turned back on, there probably will be a fair amount of well servicing work to be had.
See, and it's so interesting because, again, I love this conversation, and I'm sure listeners are probably like listening to the debates last night. There are those who have specific examples of this one time where they didn't pickle a well and it caused a whole issue. And David, how can you say that? Like, what are you doing? But to me, everything is just about using data and your brain. And so, I wrote a white paper for the Department of Energy in March. They didn't ask for me to write it, but I said, okay, how do we resolve this issue given that oil is 25 and that the world is using 65 million barrels a day, but it's still producing 100. So 35 million barrels a day each and every day from around the world until OPEC shut in was going into storage. Storage is bought by financial players who are renting boats and renting trucks and renting everything to store barrels and sell it back. And what that meant was that those were barrels the companies would never get back, and they would lose control over selling them, so that they were selling them to Goldman Sachs for 25, who is now selling them for 40. The royalty owner got 25% of 25, not 25% of 40. And now Goldman Sachs controls the price. Now, it's not Goldman Sachs, but you know what I mean. And one of the comments I made was, there are 40% base decline, which means that at any given time, 40% of the production in this country is from wells that came on in the last 6 to 9 months. Those are the wells you shut in first, because they don't have rods a lot of the times. They're flowing. Or if you have an ESP, you pull the ESP and don't rerun it. Or like each well was different, but I was always amazed that I would talk to production engineers and completion engineers at the time. And they're like, oh, well, David, you're not thinking about my this well. And I was like, well, no, every well is different. Shut in your big wells. I know management wants to be able to report all these IPs and bullshit, but keep your 1 barrel a day well on that might have a problem and might never come back, and shut in your 1,000 barrel a day well, which will flush all the lost volumes when you bring it on anyway. It shouldn't be that hard, and yet it was.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. And each operator, different, assets, different stories, obviously. But maybe one of the pieces missing is that a lot of those older, lower producing wells, it costs more to maintain them and operate them and run them. And you're always bringing in the likes of us and other service lines to work on those wells. And so once you kind of bake that cost in, it might be better to just shut those down and have, the preponderance of your barrels coming from your big newer wells.
Yeah. And I don't disagree. And so, and that is a great point that transitions us to P&A. Because in a $50 to $60 world, there were a lot of 2-3 barrel a day marginal wells holding leases. You go, but at some point, if it's $20,000 or $15,000 to fix the pump, and it goes down every 6 months, 9 months, pick your number, those wells become marginal and uneconomic. And in a $40 run rate world versus a $60 run rate world, there's a lot of wells in the United States that are probably not economic. When we had Breezy Carlson on the show in March, one of her pilot projects and things that she focuses on a lot is orphan wells. But companies never reserve the cash flow to spend the $50 or $75 or $100 or $200,000 per well to abandon them. And when we have these big changes in commodity price, we end up with thousands of wells that we have to abandon. As you think about that business model and that challenge, but that opportunity for your company, where does P&A and orphan wells and everything else fit into that thinking go forward?
Yes, sir. You said the E&Ps don't have the cash flow to reserve for the P&A. The estimated cost of the P&A at the end of the life of the well is baked into the reservoir analysis.
No, for sure it's there. But the cash has been paid out to shareholders, paid out to debt, paid out to salaries, paid out to drilling. So at the end of the life, when you have 100 wells, it's not like they kept the $200,000 per well in a little piggy bank.
No, and the point I was just going to finish there is just because it's baked into the reserves, it doesn't mean that the cash is there. But cash at an upstream E&P or cash in a small service company is a concern, well beyond, just P&A. Is there enough cash margin, free cash flow in the domestic unconventional space? P&A is kind of like, it's a not sexy part of our business, right? Like if there is any sexiness to U.S. workover rigs, it's not P&A. And we're kind of like the fishermen, our customers don't want to see us. They don't want to pay us. They don't want to have to deal with us.
Oh, fishermen always, fishing.
Yeah, exactly. And the poor production engineer that's straight out of mines, that's, responsible for the P&A program at his company, it's a tough position. There's very little upside. There's unlimited downside. And, how do you do well? What's your KPI in that? It's just, spend within budget and get this number of P&As knocked out on this timeline and don't spend $1 more. And yet the P&A is some of the most complex jobs that we sometimes face, because a lot of times these wells, depending on how they were acquired by the operator, they don't have good chain of custody. of the data and the records on the well, and you don't know what you're dealing with downhole. But it's an older well that for sure has issues downhole, and it's going to be a challenge that you're going to have to solve real time. And you hear about these problem P&As, these P&As that were on the books for a $30,000 reclamation and ends up being $1 million or something like that.
Yeah.
Those are real issues. And then you look at the service side, and many, not all of our competitors, the P&A business is like where assets go to die. It's like, well, those are the little assets, the old assets, hasn't been capitally maintained, and lots of little independents that aren't focused on, training and doctrine and PPE and, certifying lifting equipment and everything. The bid goes to the lowest provider to go do this really complex, not sure what you're dealing with downhole operation. So, that was a lot, but P&A has actually been I think it's some of the most intellectually interesting, jobs that we
absolutely. Horrible cost center, awesome intellectual challenge.
Yeah, exactly. And we just try to do as best we can for our customers to, help them through it, help them make the right economic decisions and get the problem solved as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
Well, I'm going to say two controversial things that our E&P listeners, like as we think about regulations. Number one, I thought it was a horrible opportunity wasted for the RRC and all of the regulatory bodies in our country to not ban operational flaring. And by operational flaring, I mean flaring for 45 days, 60 days, waiting for pipelines. Or, if a plant was full and it was projected to stay full, producing for a day into pipeline and flaring for 5 days. I really thought that since methane is a greenhouse gas, there is questions around the benefits of global warming, and it's certainly a hot button issue. We should have outlawed it because that would have picked the wells, most of them new, most of them high rates, most of them without wellbore integrity issues, that would have been shut down, and we would have built infrastructure to bring that flaring. I thought it was a horrible missed opportunity, and for the companies that fought against it, I know why they did, but it was poor. We could have done better. But on the P&A side, I truly believe that the reason that PDP acquisitions and this new business model, PDP heavy, etc., is really tough is if I go bid 1,000 well field, the reality is those 1,000 wells, I should abandon 50 a year, and they're probably going to cost me $100,000 a year. If I build in a $5 million or whatever P&A cost every single year and build that into my cash flow, I probably don't have the winning bid to buy that asset at an attractive enough level. And so I would say the regulatory bodies should increase the bonds to a per well bond for all companies in the United States that put $10,000 per well on every well they operate as a bond, so that there is at least a kitty that forces abandonment. Now, it will crush the small producers, but we're in a consolidation phase, which we're going to talk about in OFS. And so, if anything, it just accelerates it into the hands of the bigs who own all the wells and have the capital to deal with the abandonment, so we don't need a Superfund site to take care of 100,000 well bores over the course of the next 100 years. I don't want you to comment on that because I know it's very controversial for your clients. But that to me, again, this isn't about don't frack. 67% of natural gas wells in the United States and 100% of shale oil wells need to frack. And if you don't, we will just import more oil from other countries and it won't do anything for our demand. But a real issue is methane emissions, flaring, and P&A. And so to me, we should address those issues. And if I'm Exxon, Chevron, Shell, BP, Oxy, I'm pushing that because that will be the final straw to knock out the small guys and the small capital and consolidate. So a view. Comment if you wish.
I'm not going to go too far. That is some controversial stuff. Again, especially with this listenership, bringing in, suggesting that more government regulation is what our industry, needs to, right itself. Is
Well, and to be clear, I'm not advocating regulation. I'm declaring don't flare and have a bond, which we already have, but not 25,000 or 50,000 for the entire company. I'm talking $10,000 per operated well. Now, for you, that might mean that there's orphan wells. That gives an orphan well fund for service companies to bid on P&A work and actually start handling this, because there's actually hundreds of millions of dollars available to deal with our problem. So I'm not advocating regulation. I'm advocating like a nuanced change to the existing, like tax code. The tax code will always exist, but let's look at the elements of the tax code that we can streamline or simplify that make more sense. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, on the former point, going back a couple of companies, I'll do a quick plug. In 2012, we were very early in the Bakken to, as a small upstream E&P, to start thinking about how to build our own gathering transportation. The capillaries, not the main arteries here, and the economics were such that it was taking the trucks off the road, and it was safer and cleaner and more efficient, all the stuff that we know in industry. And this is before most of the E&Ps were doing that. So as a little guy, and we put together a JV to do just that, and to move our molecules across our acres into the bigger trunk lines. And the reason, one of the other reasons we got into that was very much the same reason we got into rock pile and fracking, was service supply constraints and not great deals by the providing the service providers at that time. But it was as important as all that stuff was. It was efficient, and our wells, in very early 2012, 2013, were not flaring. We were getting hooked up to gas, simultaneous with when the wells were coming online as just a little guy. And, we've now seen, much of industry kind of move that direction. And now it's almost commonplace to see the E&Ps, building out their own, small gathering systems here and there. But I'm proud to be a small part of that small effort. I think it was a little bit ahead of its time, and it was the right thing, for our stakeholders, all of our stakeholders. And that's, a broader, comment on another hot buzzword, which I think is important. I think all of us as oil and gas leadership need to be real, need to be mindful about ESG concerns, at risk of stating the obvious. And anywhere that we can make a little bit better decision, a cost effective decision, to be mindful of all of our various stakeholders and to reduce methane, we should try to do that. I do not advocate for more government enforcement of that, but I do think we all need to do our part, and that helps the conversations that we have to have with the non-believers.
Well, at One Energy, we were the exact same. I would not turn a well on unless it was hooked up to gas. But we were private, which then, it puts into context what you said, the big bad Wall Street people. It was the Wall Street people in the first place that wanted the growth, that then gave share price performance appreciation to those who grew, so that they could loan the debt to the companies to continue to grow. And then when everyone did exactly what they were asked to do and what they were rewarded to do, then Wall Street's like, actually, we want free cash flow. And there's a whole bunch of other parts of our broken business. But to me, you were always going to build the gas line. And in order to pay for it, the first month of gas would probably pay for your $100,000 or $150,000 hookup rather than flaring it. So, you could drill a $3 million well with a $5 million completion, get your ducts in place, build your facilities, do your ducts, and call it a day. I was always surprised, but it was Wall Street wanting quarter to quarter production growth, performance, cash flow, all these things that then companies would cut corners and race to go get their wells on at the end of the quarter so that they could publish quarterly numbers that Wall Street loved, but ultimately Wall Street abandoned our industry anyway. So it's kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah, look, I believe in extreme ownership, and meaning we as leaders in the industry shouldn't point fingers at, Wall Street, influencing us to make bad decisions. We make the bad decisions on our own, plenty. And we don't need Wall Street to tell us to get cash flow positive, not now or not in 2011. It's a business. It needs to be, on a goal towards cash flow positivity at some point. So that's what I'll,
No, I totally agree. So let's talk consolidation, because one of the things you said, there's 1,400 active service rigs at peak. We went down to 300 and then we're going up somewhere. But in order to lower or raise the barriers to entry, you can't have these mom and pops who have 5 service rigs going bankrupt and the creditors selling that equipment for 3 cents on the dollar, because then someone else's cost basis will just be lower than yours. And then from a profitability standpoint, it's a race to the bottom. One of the solutions I proposed around drilling rigs, because I don't think we'll ever get back to the 1,000 or the 800 or the 600. I think that we're going to be in a 200 to 300 range realistically, is that every driller that's big should be buying the drilling rigs and taking a blowtorch to them and scrapping them, so that they're destroying the 25 million of cost, but they're taking that drilling rig out of the market forever. Or they should ship it overseas to Saudi Arabia, whatever. But you have to evacuate the capacity. With that context, how do you consolidate a fragmented OFS build situation with such low utilization and hard to value where it goes and what the rigs are worth and replacement value? How do you think through acquisitions?
Yeah, well, we built the company deliberately through acquisition. And so in the last almost 4 years, I've looked at over 30 well servicing companies. We put 7 LOIs out and we've closed on 5. And those 5 feel like 10 to 15 because some of those service companies had disparate, regional, differently branded, differently managed businesses underneath. We have gone about integrating, consolidating, and trying to professionalize and standardize, process, training, systems, et cetera, in the businesses. And we've done, I think, a decent job at that over the last few years. So, I'm one of the only, service players, companies out there in U.S. well servicing that has been consolidating over the last number of years. And part of our investment thesis way back in late 2016 was that consolidation amongst our customers, of which I used to be, is going to potentially drive a need for a handful of better scaled up companies that are grown-ups and understand and are trying to do the right thing out there and be good service partners, and deliver value to our customers as they are scaling up and getting larger. So that's consolidation. Now you hit on an awesome, kind of a softball right down the middle of the plate for me earlier with your comments on blowtorching drilling rigs, because that has been a big, pet peeve and hot button issue here with me and at Brigade and with our capital partners. And I think that one of the, really unfortunate dynamics of our space is exactly what you just said, is this pass down of antiquated, under-spec, under-capitally maintained, potentially unsafe assets from one company and one owner to the next without that reinvestment. And so, we never wanted to be the biggest well servicing company in the U.S. We wanted to be the best, ambitiously. And we're the 4th largest well servicing company in the U.S. right now, and the largest private, 3 years into our journey. And so now we have a seat at the table as we think about, what to do with these antiquated assets. At one point, we had 200 or so workover rigs. Today, we have about 165. And I expect that we'll get down to about 140 to 150 over the next 6 to 12 months. And we are not doing what almost everybody has done in our space for many, many years and decades, which is trading the rigs into one of our value vendors to get some credit, to buy some new capital equipment, or pushing them out in auction to a down market independent who's going to buy this $1 million+ replacement value piece of equipment for the cost of a used pickup truck. That doesn't make any sense to us, and it's not good for all of the stakeholders in the oil field, not to mention the the field employee that's going to end up on that equipment at, the down market operator down the road. And so we have a campaign that's called our Dinosaur Decommissioning Campaign. You can find a link to it on our webpage. And we've been videoing, dinosaurs eating dinosaurs. It brings out the 5-year-old boy in you to watch a giant machine tear apart another giant machine. And it's just awesome to see. And we video it and we throw them up and we say a little bit about the legacy equipment that we're decommissioning and taking apart. And it's gotten a little bit of buzz and momentum. And I think that if the other 20 or so major well servicers in the U.S., if most of them had a similar campaign, we would do right by our industry, right by our people, right by our customers, and really clean up some of the space.
I absolutely love that, because that is essential. And to the acquisition, of course, the seller wants to get credit for 40 rigs. 30 of them are old, they're $1 million each, and they're trying to, because they're trying to sell and liquidate. But as the buyer, if you can buy the right companies and everyone in industry can decommission these, there is a net benefit. If everyone took 20% out of their fleet, there's 20% less fleet that will ever come back, that will ever allow someone to start up, that will ever be used unsafely and at a cost that is not replacement. I think it's a wonderful idea. I absolutely love that you're doing that.
And by the way, that is one of the barriers to entry to our space, capital intensity, especially in times like this. And if the independents have to go get $1 million to add a rig, then it restricts their ability to do that. And look, I'm not limiting competition. There are over 200 well services.
100%.
In any basin. You could pick the sleepiest basin of yesterdecade somewhere in the country, and we have 5 competitors.
Right.
So,
I love that you felt like you had to say it, and everyone forgets that Coke and Pepsi dominate like 80% of the entire market. The most any service company, any oil company dominates of the space is like 10%, and that's Saudi Arabia. And Facebook, there is literally antitrust things going through Congress because Facebook is like the dominant and only. Google, the dominant and only. And we get like nervous when there's hundreds of competitors and access and all this stuff, and we're 10% of the market, and we worry about some of these things. So I appreciate that you said that, but yeah, 100%. So if you could go back to the beginning of Triangle and you could meet yourself there and you could give yourself some advice that through the ups and the downs would have helped that company perform better. Maybe survive is the right answer. I know that there is an entity that is the surviving entity of that, but what would you have said to yourself, knowing what you now know over the last 10 years?
Well, I wish I could do that exercise many times over in my life. If I could just, can I go further back to 21?
You're gonna get that question too. But I thought, given that we started with Triangle, and just I had Clay Gaspar on the podcast that'll come out this Sunday, and we talked about hedging. And one of the interesting things, I interpret this current commodity cycle the same way I interpreted when I started my career in 1997. And I was in the marketing department, and oil went from 30 to 12 over the summer I was there, and the company I was working for went bankrupt. And it didn't make sense to me why, if $30 was a perfectly good price and you understood what your reserves and type curves were, why you wouldn't just hedge 100% of your volume, take commodity price risk totally out of it. Then obviously nobody did. We went through the downturn in 2000, then prices spiked. Then they went down again in 2014. And I was like, I still don't understand why people didn't like $100 a barrel. And then it happened again where oil was 50 and then it went to 25. And I would have thought companies were going to come out of this by saying, I'm going to hedge more. If I'm a natural gas player who saw $1.80, we're at $3 right now, I would hedge 100% of my volumes that I could between now and the next 2 years at $3, because maybe it goes to $4. That means the value of my company goes up. But if it goes back to 180, I can survive. So I would have thought hedging was going to go up. What Clay said was, with the merger of Devon and WPX, they have more diversity across their asset portfolio, and they're actually thinking about hedging less than the WPX entity. that was a very interesting view that I thought was different. So to you in 2010, 2009, Triangle, et cetera, and then we'll go back to 2001.
Yeah, sure. Look, you asked what I would have done different, and then you started talking about hedging. So there's a little bit of a lead there. I think that first off, in regards to hedging, I know lots about it. I used to be a trader on the largest crude vol book and biggest hedger in the world. So know enough to be dangerous at least. In regards to Triangle, and it's sensitive. Look, I have tons of friends, throughout that organization back then and still today. And it was a tough situation on the way down. And for many other companies then, and for many companies today, some of the things that happened in 2014 are affecting things that are happening in companies today. 5, 6 years later, and much of that cheap leverage that was applied across industry, from upstream to services and everything in between, was 8 non-call 3 paper that's due in 2020 to 2023 or what have you. And so very few companies across the value chain were completely immune to waving in cheap leverage. And you might have, if back then you were going to stand on a pedestal and say, we should take none of this, even though all of our competitors are, and I say competitors loosely because E&Ps don't necessarily compete that much other than for talent and capital. But other people are exploding their equity value and growing acres and getting better people and doing more development and growing the production and getting closer to cash flow. But I don't think we should take that cheap leverage and try to explode value. You might have been laughed out of the boardroom, depending on the company. And if you were a management team that couldn't go get it, you might have been replaced. Who knows? So hindsight's always 20/20. Experience is what you get when you don't get what you want. When I look back to the turn, let's call it after Thanksgiving of 2014. And nobody knew that was the turn, but that was the turn. And the peak might have been somewhere around July or August or something of 14. Our most levered business was, and I'm not going to say too much about this. This is sensitive stuff, but our most levered business was 2.1 times, leverage ratio, debt to EBITDA. Not that bad, fairly conservative. That was our E&P business. It had just termed out its debt for 8 years on a covenant light piece of paper that Wall Street loved. And we were sitting on, I think, $500 million of liquidity. We had 80% of our barrels hedged for 18 months. And we had this great family of companies and teams that gave us a lot of different levers to potentially pull if we had to. So I don't think it was how we went into the turn in that company that was necessarily controversial or, was well executed or delivered. It was what happened next. And, hindsight 2020, decisions were made that might have been more aggressive than conservative. And had market turned, which many thought that it would have or could have, aggressive decisions would have been applauded and rewarded, and people would have been seen as heroes. But that didn't happen. The market continued its march downwards. And at the end of the day, look, I'm an ex, Navy guy and Goldman trader. I think about worst case scenarios, not best case scenarios. So I tend to be a conservative guy for what that's worth. But even if we did the most conservative move on every single decision point from 14 on, it's unclear whether or not that would have ultimately, saved the ship, so to speak, because we and many others had too much leverage in our system.
I really love that answer, because I did not remember that Triangle was 80% hedged. I did not remember that they had just put in 8-year paper, and I did not remember the relatively low leverage. And so, you think about it, as you said, in hindsight 2020, obviously with those things in place, one might have said, well, we're actually in a good place. Let's let someone else be optimistic. Let's sell the company now. But this is the fallacy of the trader and the investor, that they don't sell, like when their stock used to be 100 and now it's 60. They're like, well, we'll get back to 100. I want to get back to 100. I don't want to sell at 60. And when you compare and contrast to today, management teams are actively saying, we don't believe we will get back to the valuation we were at a year or 2 years ago. So we're actually punching our ticket now before things arguably even get worse, which is a different part of the cycle than in 2014. And I think why we didn't really see the consolidation we should have back then, and we are seeing it now, and we're seeing it in a big way. Do you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I think I agree with much of that. I think that there's this hindsight bias. You forget that you try to make the best decisions available with the information available at that time. And when you look back on it, you know whether that was the right decision or not, and whether you're a hero or a zero, so to speak. I also know that a Marine general that's never been in a firefight isn't really worth much as a general. And we have a bunch of leaders in industry right now that if they were in decision-making executive positions going through it that back then or right now, they are better generals, because they've now had a few firefights and they have battle scars to attempt to make better decisions for what that's worth. When
it's a great point. It's a really
you and I are relatively young men in industry, and when I talk to mentors and friends that are older and were in the industry in the 80s, and they're like, well, this is my 10th downturn, and they start listening through. And I'm like, well, what was your position in the first 8?
Right.
Because if you were just a small cog in the machine and getting told what to do, I'm not sure it counts as much as if you were in the pilot house trying to make the decisions.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It totally makes a difference. And the learning that I had over the 20 years of my career was the people that I knew that were the most successful, and by successful, I mean financial, all of them sold their companies when the getting was good. And I think that people forget that. Like we think about our industry as this long-term cyclical thing that, Exxon's been in for 100 years, et cetera. But like over the scheme of investors, the people who sold their business at the high are the ones who made the money, and the people who bought their businesses at the low are the ones who made the money when they sold at the high. And so, but you're totally right about generals. Now, if you could go back to your whole life, and this is my last question for you, if you could go back to your whole life and give yourself advice that would accelerate your journey and would have really made meaningful impact on you today, what would that advice be?
Yeah, I think there's probably some country music songs about this or something, but
probably.
I don't have any regrets. Man, I've been blessed many times over. I'll say this, my greatest accomplishment in life, not to get too cheesy or on a soapbox here, but it's behind me. It's in arrears. And that's as a young naval officer, Navy SEAL, platoon commander, 4 deployments, 3 to the Middle East, 2 to Iraq. I brought all my guys home back in one piece. And it wasn't because we were sitting behind the wire playing Nintendo. We were getting after it. And much like our industry, just like in the service, it's better to be lucky than good. And we got lucky, many times over. And I was able to bring all those guys back to their moms and wives and sisters and kids. And so that's my greatest accomplishment. Always will be to my last day. And that that life experience. I could say, man, 12 years in the Navy, 18 to 30, that set me back professionally on being further along and knowing more and doing more in U.S. oil and gas and in the career that I've chosen. But I wouldn't make the trade. I wouldn't go back and give up that time and give up that life experience, because that life experience every day conditions, my outlook, my high pain threshold, as the case might be for the space that we've all chosen here.
Mm-hmm.
And I spot, learn lessons, leadership lessons, humility, through that I think still benefit me today. And the same goes for all the next moves. 3 years as a trader at Goldman, that was a tough job. That I never want to go back to. The biggest thing I learned from the esoteric, non-transferable skill sets that I picked up at Goldman Sachs was I don't want to be a trader for the rest of my life. But I learned a lot. And so you could say, well, there's another 3 years wasted, or 2 years of business school wasted because you weren't in industry. Well, I learned a lot in those experiences, which helped me today. And for me, my vision, back to the vision quest, I realized that a big, being challenged, doing something that's important and meaningful. And I think we're doing that in U.S. well servicing, and also learning a lot and continually learning is kind of what drives me as a human. And so try to always put myself in a position where I am learning. And through all those experiences, I learned valuable things outside of industry through totally different worlds that we try to bring to bear to benefit this organization in the space that we play in today. So I
love that answer.
A little bit too much, but I wouldn't. Do I wish that there were some different outcomes here and there along the way? Of course, we all have that. We all, man, I could have made a better decision. There was decisions I made yesterday that I could have done better, But
I love that answer. So first, thank you for your service and for making our country what it is today. And then I think second to that, the big learning, at least that I took, was no years that you spent were wasted, and that you made the best of the opportunity that you had at the time. And all of those learnings led you to where you are today. And so, be patient, enjoy the journey, enjoy the ride, and don't be looking over the fence at Sam and Bob and seeing what they're doing and wondering if you should be doing it too, because your journey was just a different journey and you ended up in exactly the same place. So that's what I took from that. Is that a fair paraphrase?
Yeah, I think so. I appreciate that. And look, I appreciate your comment on the service. As I say all the time, my service wasn't selfless; it was selfish, because I was having a hell of a good time and doing exactly what I wanted to be doing when I was a young man.
That's all we can ask. Well, I really appreciate you joining us today, Justin, and talking about the oilfield service and digging deep, because I think that the E&Ps are always the one who are kind of driving investment decisions and capital decisions, but it's the people at your company and your peer companies that are the ones that, in a lot of the times, doing the work and holding our industry together. And without you, we can't keep the wells on, we can't P&A the wells, and we can't move forward. So I love your dinosaur eating campaign. I think that's awesome, and I really look forward to staying in touch and hearing about how the next year goes for you and the company.
Thank you, David, for your time today. Been an awesome conversation, and all that you're doing, for industry. I think it's great, and I hope it grows and has wonderful success. And the last plug, look, all the credit at Brigade and all of my other prior organizations goes completely to the men and women at the field level that are out there right now, as you and I are talking, in an HVAC controlled environment and pontificating about big industry themes. I've got 300 or so men in the elements right now, tripping pipe. There's a physicality to the job, but they're also, using their head and solving problems and trying to do right by our customers. So a quick, thank you and appreciation to the employees of Brigade. They are what really make it happen out there.
And thank you to them, which brings me to my sign off, because the first one is always be safe. Second one is always be good. And the third is have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.